And yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's nice to come and do a talk at another Northwest university. So this talk is about the so-called word gap, which maybe some of you have heard about. It's pretty prominent in UK policy at the moment and has been for quite a while, as I'll show. But really what I focus on in this talk is a much more critical perspective on the word gap than often gets talked about in mainstream narratives about language and education. And in particular, I talk about that in terms of what's called raciolinguistic ideologies, which I'll talk about. And on the image on the screen here actually is just a fab image that an artist that I collaborate with, Wendy Wong, produced. And Wendy does brilliant images that try and translate like academic theory and knowledge into more visual representations. And so this image here came out of a project that I was doing on the word gap, and just gives you a sense of some of the more critical perspectives on offer here. The idea that words, or this impression that words matter so much that it can weigh people down and have kind of significant bearing on people's lives, particularly those that are racialised, and particularly those that are children that are racialised. So the talk really draws on an article that I published in Critical Inquiry and Language Studies last year called Word Rich or Word Poor, Deficit Discourses, etc. And so that's what I'll talk about mostly, but it also touches on another couple of papers, one of which I published last year with a colleague, Julia Snell, which is all about Ofsted and language ideologies and language policing in the inspectorate, which has links with some of the ideas about the word gap. And then finally, which I'll talk very briefly about, is just another one coming out in the next couple of days, I think, in race, ethnicity and education. So they're all open access. So I'm assuming that everyone's here has got institutional access, but yeah, if you're interested and want to read a little bit more about this work, then those are good places to start, really. So the headlines from this work then, and I guess the things that I really want people to try and take away from this talk, is that these narratives around the so-called word gap are really, really problematic, because they're rooted in this idea that working class and racialised children, so children that are marginalised intersectionally, display vocabulary sizes that are smaller and vocabulary that is lower quality when compared against the language practices of the white middle class. And those same narratives pose that is one of the core reasons that they struggle in school. And through those logics, school then becomes a space where they must be kind of compensated for these purported, like deemed to what are deficiencies through various forms of remedial intervention, such as explicit vocabulary instruction, timetable out of lessons, etc., as we'll see. So it feels in a way that word gap narratives are quite new, but actually what we'll see is that actually they have a really long history. They're anchored to some of those very deep-rooted British colonial logics that are rooted in white supremacist thinking and anti-black thinking, and then really bolstered by some certain forms of academic knowledge production from the 60s and the 50s all the way through to the 90s. And those same narratives really are all about placing the blame on marginalised speakers for these supposed failures, but recently under these quite kind of benevolent and kind of seemingly well-meaning guises of like social justice or racial justice, and also as part of a new narrative around the so-called what works agenda. And crucially, those same interventions then get posed as a kind of solution for a whole range of broader structural inequalities, which in turn absolves the state of their own responsibilities. So they work to reduce, they work in a really reductive logic way that just re-emphasises and repins the blame on marginalised children for their perceived linguistic and cultural failures. So I'm just going to return to some fieldwork notes that I made in a school in southeast London that I do a lot of work with some incredible teachers and children there. And this school has a large proportion of Black children, Black Caribbean children, and an overrepresentation of white staff. So fairly typical in terms of staff demographics in England. And I was on the school doing some fieldwork visit where I was doing some work on language and language and race. And I was waiting in the classroom and just chatting to this group of young Black boys who I'd got to know. And these boys were just incredible in the way that they used language, right? They were talking about race, about power, about identity, and how in school, like, they were perceived to use language in ways which the school had decided was deficient. So even though they displayed this absolutely remarkable sense of linguistic creativity and innovation and dexterity, using highly specific and highly complex vocabulary and highly complicated syntax and grammatical structures to do so, the school took quite a different perception on the way that they were using language and really ignored actually what they could do with their language. So certain teachers described their language as limited, as lacking, as like inappropriate. They were kind of repeatedly told to speak properly in standard English. And the school was one of those schools that really quite heavily subscribed to these new ideologies of the word gap, where those same black boys and other children in the school were being subjected to these highly artificial and very decontextualized scripted lessons in order to try and fix these like supposed defects, right? But those defects were completely imaginary. They didn't actually exist at all, because if you actually listened to those boys and actually got them to do tasks that were culturally relevant to them, for example, then actually they were perfectly capable of using language in ways that the school had deemed to be inappropriate. So in the class, the boys kept very quiet. They kind of produced these one-word answers. They were accused of like not being able to speak in full sentences. They were accused of not using the right academic vocabulary, whatever that means. And so it was really, really problematic that we had these two perceptions of the same children's language going on. And I want to start that story because this really gets to the root of what word gap narratives are often about. And I also want to stress that this is by no means not a critique of an individual teacher or indeed a school, but a really oppressive structure which is long established in England, which frames those type of children as displaying linguistic deficiencies and inadequacies that require this kind of remediation. So they're also part of these really durable narratives about language in schools. So we need to think about the broader social context in which word gap narratives have kind of been re-normalized, if you will. So especially over the last 10 years or so, last 10 to 15 years, there's a real mainstream narrative now around so-called degenerate communities which require this remediation, with narratives of social and urban decay and decline that's illustrated in chaotic classrooms and homes. As a symptom of that, language often gets pinned as like a thing that's a result of that. So discourses and narratives around purported declining standards and poor vocabulary. And as part of those logics, those very same marginalised children are repeatedly told that, well, if all you would do is abandon the way that you speak and abandon your own culture and assimilate essentially towards this sense of idealised whiteness or idealised middle classness, then that will be the thing that grants you social justice and social mobility. So for me, those things aren't at all about social justice, because all that's doing is maintaining those existing structures and hierarchies where it poses a challenge to the white status quo. So word gap narratives are part of that bigger narrative and bigger social context. So to critique those ideologies about the word gap, then, we need to take what Flores and Rosa call the raciolinguistic perspective, where they critique those really deeply embedded beliefs about the language practices of racialized and low-income speakers. And those ideologies that they display, those deficiencies, have a really long history that are tethered and anchored to forms of European, specifically British colonialism, where the same type of language was deemed to be lacking and deficient and indeed full of kind of gaps, because they were failing to meet those arbitrary linguistic benchmarks that had been set by powerful white listeners. So those ideologies about language are as much about social class as they are about race, especially in places like England, where intersectionality is really the only way of making sense in terms of how race and class are bonded together, and how intersectional inequality has really long shaped the fabric of society in schools. So we can't separate out race from class. Like, class is race and race is class, and that's a really important perspective to avoid like siloing off race from class and vice versa. So as part of this, then, schools have kind of long been a space where those ideologies circulate. where teachers can get positioned or seek to kind of cure these supposed linguistic deficiencies and these kind of long established like missionary kind of narratives and logics, such as filling gaps where words are absent and placing marginalised speakers in corrective programmes in remediation. So often done under this kind of well-meaning guise, but actually is only serving to maintain the racialised status quo. So to critique this, then, we need to take what's called a ratiolinguistic perspective, and that's just a really simple shift in analytical attention. So for so long, critique and analysis has been focused on the actual language that racialised and low-income speakers display, and as a result of their language practices being stigmatised. So much critique and analysis is focused on that. Whereas a ratiolinguistic perspective says, well, no, like the problem doesn't lie there at all, right? Actually, we need to shift our analytical attention, not towards the speaker, but towards the listener. So Rosa and Flores conceptualise this in terms of the white listening subject, which is essentially a racialised mode of perception, like a way of perceiving and categorising the language practices of racialised and economically marginalised speakers. And that, of course, can be through individuals, but it can also be through systems and policies and pedagogies and curricula and various other kinds of systems which continue to frame the way that marginalised speakers are purported to display these linguistic shortcomings. So my focus is not on the stigmatised speaker, my focus is on the oppressive listener. So my work also takes a really long historical approach in tracing some of how those historical ideas about language continue to surface in contemporary policy. So we can trace back some of those ideas about the limited vocabulary of marginalised speakers through to at least 1500s British colonial discourse, where British colonisers would very regularly deploy these kinds of narratives in their representations of colonised communities, using those representations in order to justify oppressive colonial regimes. Fast forward a long time and we get to the 1950s, and those ideas kind of regained academic credibility and indeed were bolstered in academic knowledge production, specifically with people like Basil Bernstein, who talked about the difference between working class speakers' so-called restricted code when compared against the so-called elaborated code of the middle class. And indeed, some psychologists of the time, so some European psychologists, going one step further and actually arguing that those perceived defects were genetic, so reproducing those connections between language, biological racism, and racial hierarchies. Most of you will probably know people like Bernard Coard's work, who in the 1960s and 70s exposed the way that Black Caribbean children were being placed into schools for the so-called educationally subnormal. And a big part of those ideas and those perceptions were about language, where those Black Caribbean children were deemed to display these limited vocabulary structures, simplified syntax, inarticulate grammar, etc., in ways that still continue today. Direct instruction was a kind of key way of key intervention of claiming to fix these purported deficiencies, with the work of Karl Barita and Engelman claiming that those marginalised children were restricted by limited grammar, posing that explicit vocabulary teaching was a solution, and that's really seen a resurgence in the last 5 years or so, as we'll see. And those deficit perspectives were revived in 1995 with a book by Betty Hart and Todd Risley called Meaningful Differences in the Everyday Experience of Young American Children. And I'm giving Hart and Risley's book a whole slide here because this book is super, super important in thinking about how the word gap itself was conceptualized as a construct, as a very explicit construct, but also how Hart and Risley's work continues to have an enormous amount of influence over current policy making and current thinking in England's education system. So to give a sense of what Hart and Risley's work was about, and it's a book, so I'm only obviously giving one slide's worth of coverage to it here, but their central thesis was that high income and white families talk A, more frequently, and B, with a wider variety of vocabulary when compared against black children from who were living in poverty. And that was one of the core reasons why those marginalised and racialised children might face challenges in school. So really locating language as one of the core reasons why those marginalised children might experience structural inequality. So I think you can probably already see the problems with that, right? It's beginning to pose that actually the problems aren't caused at all by structural racism. The problems are caused by language, or at least perceptions of language itself, which is a really reductive logic. So Hart and Risley's method was really flawed. It was really racist, and I'll talk about why that was the case. So they simply observed 42 families in Kansas City from 3 different socioeconomic groups, from professional, working class and welfare. And they tracked children in those families from when they were very young, from about 7 months to around 3 years old. And they recorded the interaction between parents and their children, and calculated the average number of words that those children were exposed to, and then used those numbers to produce this like mathematical model of what they claim was 30 million. So their kind of central result was that the children from low-income families hear 30 million fewer words than their high-income counterparts. And that itself was what they called the word gap. So that's where the phrase itself comes from. So despite that being hugely problematic in terms of its like really crude ways of how it thinks about how to measure language and linguistic quality, the sampling itself was deeply racist. So from the 13 families in the professional category, just 1 of those were African American, whereas the 6 families in the welfare category, the lowest socio-economic category, all 6 of those were African American. So collapsing race and poverty together in really, really problematic ways. So Hart and Risley's work continues to kind of gain traction and gain influence. And indeed, you see it on Twitter. Here's a tweet just from before Christmas from a teacher calling it famous research, which is known in education as the word gap. So just note here how Hart and Risley's work is being talked about. So note the kind of very classist, very deficit ways in which this is being talked about. So children of higher status or educated parents hear more advanced and more complex syntactical structures. So those ideologies or those beliefs and attitudes about language are getting mapped on to, and indeed reinforcing, class, race, and other kinds of social hierarchies. So those ideas about language get mapped on and index much, much bigger things. So I'm certainly not the first person to critique Hart and Risley's work. There's been multiple critiques, mostly from North America, but a kind of growing sense of a critical movement here in the UK. And those critiques have long exposed how that concept is based on this flawed and racist methodology that's underpinned by that ratio-linguistic ideology that I talked about earlier, and as something that reframes the linguistic practices of marginalised families as genetically deficient, and that is one of the root causes of their poor performance in school. However, those same narratives provide the state with this like really seemingly seductive and attractive solution to structural inequalities and social injustice, because they pose that language itself is the issue, and therefore language-based interventions provide the solution to structural inequalities. So those language-based interventions, i.e. more vocabulary and better vocabulary, seems to be the answer, at least in the eyes and the ears of the state, to solving structural inequality. So that might give you a sense about why it's become so seductive to the state, because it indeed absolves themselves of their own responsibilities, of course, who have crafted that very sense of structural racism and inequality in the first place. So just beginning to trace through how these ideas became so normalised in England. So we can trace back some of the very early mentions of vocabulary in the word gap through the Hansard records, which are the record of parliamentary debates. And one of the earliest records that I found was from Jean Gross, who was referencing a document that she wrote called Getting in Early Primary Schools and Early Intervention in 2008. And at the time, Jean Gross, somewhat ironically, I think she was called the communication champion for the government. But I'm just showing an extract from here just to give you a sense of how she's recycling those ideas that have been long established, but indeed kind of doubled down on in Hart and Risley's work. So she's not directly citing Hart and Risley's work here, but she does do later. So saying how in a poor household a child will hear 500 words a day, well, in a rich household they'll hear 1,500, and head teachers now talking of increasing numbers of children who hear little language at home beyond what she calls the daily grunt. So really problematic narratives and metaphors that are being used to describe the language practices of marginalised children, but also in the second box, making these really ideological connections between language use and a whole load of other things such as antisocial behaviour, etc., etc. So grunts and other kind of very dehumanizing discourses are found in other types of education policy discourse. So from Ofsted, for example, here's an extract from an Ofsted report from 2003. So again, redeploying and relying on those very same animalistic and deficit discourses to describe the way that children are purportedly using nudges and grunts and simple words and phrases to communicate. So ideas about grunts and ideas about these very deficit, dehumanizing discourses were a kind of long established trope and a very normalized feature of the way that British colonizers would regularly represent the language practices of communities that they were coming into contact with through their colonial practices. So here's Thomas Herbert's writing, for example, from 1677, where he's talking about the language practices of communities in West Africa, describing how they have no speech, again, using basically the same ways of thinking and writing about language as we saw in Jean Gross and as we saw in Ofsted, and indeed talking about how they grunt like animals and what words they do have are limited and small. So I'm showing this to really kind of highlight the fact that word gap narratives might feel new, but actually they have a long colonial history and they're tethered to some of those colonial practices that long characterised British and other forms of European colonialism. Fast forward 12 years from Jean Gross when she first mentioned the word gap. Here's a training slide that she gives when she's talking about the word gap. And again, I'm not going to kind of sit here and do like a really in-depth discourse analysis of what's going on here, but I think you can see that what we have is very decontextualized representations of working class families, which are recycling those ideological connections between language use and social status, whilst at the same time doubling down on and really continuing that very long history of how working class families in particular have been actively crafted, that stigmatization against those families has been actively crafted by the state, by the media, by education policy, such as people like Imogen Tyler have long been pointing out, and a narrative that renders them responsible for their own perceived failures, whilst in turn shifting responsibility away from the state in crafting those structures of marginalisation in the first place, and blaming their use of purportedly deficient language for the reasons why they continue to be in those kinds of situations. So post-2010 policy, you're in an education department, so you'll be very aware, of course, of the standards-based reforms that came in under the coalition government from 2010 onwards. And for me, like August 2011 and the civil uprisings that occurred throughout the UK were like a key moment in how the government really doubled down on those word gap narratives and opened up this kind of ideological space where it was seen that a really sensible solution to fixing structural inequalities was through word gap interventions and through other kinds of language-based interventions. So the Evening Standard ran a piece, for example, by Lindsay Johns, where Lindsay Johns famously talks about the language practices of young people in Peckham as resembling what he called ghetto grammar, as something that was robbing them of a proper voice. And he talks here about a community, about some boys that he works with in Peckham, incidentally just down the road from that school that I was describing with at the beginning of this talk, where he talks about how he works with those boys to have a vocabulary slot where he teaches them 5 new words a week, talking about how embracing street slang is the thing that leads to disenfranchisement, marginalisation, and ultimately the dole queue. So again, reproducing those ideas that words and vocabulary and so-called proper vocabulary is the answer and the solution to fixing those broader structural inequalities. So post-2010, the word gap has kind of gained in popularity, and 2018 was a really important year in a number of different things that were produced that absolutely normalise the word gap as part of the mainstream policy narrative in the UK. So the first headline here, so teachers in the UK report growing vocabulary deficiency, is taken from The Guardian, and they're reporting on an Oxford University Press Commission report that simply asks teachers their perceptions of young people's vocabulary. So a really kind of flawed methodology and really problematic methodology that again made those ideological connections between these purported lack of words and things like lower self-esteem, negative behaviour, difficulty to make friends, mental health issues, etc. So really kind of whipping up this moral crisis where vocabulary, and I suppose lack of vocabulary, was one of the core reasons why young children continue to face struggles in schools. At the time, Damien Hinds talks about this as being a crisis. He framed young children as displaying as having an inability to produce basic language skills. So really, we want to remember we're critiquing the way that those language practices get perceived by taking that ratiolinguistic perspective to critique the listening practices rather than the speaking practices of marginalised children. So social justice is a big theme then that has provided a kind of narrative backdrop for people like Ofsted and other kind of policy influences to try and justify and indeed try to legitimise their use of word gap narratives. So Amanda Spielman and indeed people like Sean Harford and other kinds of key figures within Ofsted have really doubled down on ideologies of the word gap through this social justice narrative. So here's Spielman in 2018. Again, remember that's a really key year with the word gap. She's talking here at the Early Years Alliance conference, where she's talking about the word gap. She's just before this extract, she references Hart and Risley's work, using those exact same discourses to describe the language practices of marginalised children as being limited, as something that's holding them back, as talking about them in terms of like languagelessness ideology. So they're without words, they can't communicate properly, they're unable to do these certain things. So really, once again, pinning vocabulary and language as the sole reason why those children might indeed struggle in school. Same year, Alex Quigley, an ex-teacher who now works at the Education Endowment Foundation, published a hugely popular book, which I'll spend a bit more time looking at on the next slide, Closing the Vocabulary Gap, where again he's reproducing this idea that you can have word-rich communities and word-poor communities, and that's one of the sole reasons that might contribute to growing socio-economic disparities and socio-economic inequalities. So Quigley's book, again, just kind of deserves its own slide because it's kind of difficult to capture here the huge level of influence that this book has had in normalising word gap narratives and word gap ideologies in schools. So this book has sold in its thousands, it's hugely popular with teachers, often gets referenced on social media and indeed by policymakers as kind of the key text for teachers to use if they're looking to indeed close the vocabulary gap, as Quigley claims is so important. One of the main issues that I have with this book then is that despite it being couched in this like language of research informed practice or evidence informed practice and like robust research that schools are supposedly now meant to use, there's a complete failure and a complete absence indeed of any of those existing criticisms of word gap ideologies, some of which I talked about, but indeed some of which have been around for decades. So it's not like Quigley was suddenly able to just miss those criticisms. I would argue he actively chose not to engage with them. At the same time, it continues to recycle and indeed continues to normalise that highly reductive narrative and logic that those systematic inequalities can be addressed through solely linguistic interventions. So reproducing and recycling some of those same deficit discourses about racialised children. So he talks about such children, including those living in poverty, including those displaying multilingual abilities, as literally unable to describe their world. So right at the beginning of the book for a moment, he talks about these supposedly word poor children as left unable to describe their world, talking about how the limits of their language really do prove the limits of their world. And then in that second quote on page 2, so providing a framing for indeed the whole book, doubling down on that reductive logic that structural inequalities can be solved and addressed through those very small solutions, and he talks about how that can be found in the English dictionary. So posing a linguistic solution to indeed what is a structural problem. At the same time, and indeed gap ideologies more broadly, reproduce and recycle and subscribe to those highly Eurocentric narratives of what Susan Bloom calls wordism. So the idea that language equals words, and that the more words you know, the better, and that naming things is the main function of a language. That's a really closed, narrow, very Eurocentric way of thinking about what language is and how language works. Whereas in actual fact, language, of course, is much more than just words. Yeah. So Quigley's book reproduces some of those long established metaphors in word gap discourses of health, of nutrition, of economy, which draw these really quite troubling parallels between literal hunger and poverty with purported linguistic hunger and linguistic impoverishment. So drawing together those literal and metaphorical ideas about poverty and health and nutrition in what I would argue really problematic and arguably quite dangerous ways. We talked a little bit about Amanda Spielman. I think it's really important not to kind of locate my criticisms of Ofsted on an individual. I think that would be a really oversimplified and very dangerous way of critiquing Ofsted. So in work that me and Julia Snell, a brilliant sociolinguist at the University of Leeds, we published work in Language and Society in March last year called The White Ears of Ofsted, a raciolinguistic perspective on the listening practices of the schools inspectorate. And indeed, what we were doing in that work is taking that raciolinguistic perspective to offer an institutional and structural critique of Ofsted's position and stance on language. So Ofsted are an institution who are kind of marked and characterised by their whiteness. So that's what we mean when we're talking about those white ears. They have those institutional white ears. Its latest staff statistics in 2020 report that 92% of its inspectors identify as white. So those auditory judgments about language are being made through those white ears, and indeed highly middle class ears. I think Ofsted inspectors earn around 70 grand. I'm sure that most of them would identify with socio-economic groups concerned with the middle class. So in that work then, we built a corpus of 100,000 inspection reports that were published between 2000 and 2021. And we had that as a digital corpus. So using computer software, we were able to trace the presence of language ideologies in that corpus. There's a screenshot of the corpus just there, and you can see that I'm just searching there for the word vocabulary, and those results give you it in the middle with the context on the left and the right. So we were able to search for phrases that we felt were reflective of subjective notions and ideologies about language. For example, academic vocabulary, appropriate vocabulary, standard English, correct grammar, speak properly, articulate speech, etc., etc. Everything that is potentially reflective of an ideology. What we found in that work is that the word gap forms a really major focus of the inspectorate's work, but again, under this kind of seemingly well-meaning and seemingly benevolent and benign guise of social justice. And what we found in the work, and we were able to map on the results of the searches through to metadata from the school, so things like the postcode of the school, the number of students who are identified as racialised in some kind of way. What we found is that Ofsted repeatedly handed praise to schools who subscribe to those word gap ideologies in their own policies, while schools in areas of economic disadvantage with largely racialised children were criticised for their failure to use appropriate, ambitious, academic, etc. vocabulary. So this is really important because other schools see what's going on in other inspection reports and adapt and modify their own practices so that they fall in line with the inspectorate, because of course the risk that comes with not doing that is really serious for schools. So just as a couple of examples from Ofsted reports, so again talking about the idea that those children display poor speaking skills and weak grammar, and that, again, that phrase limited vocabulary that we've seen as being quite a normalised phrase. That's from 2004. I know that feels that it's quite a long time ago, but I think that's important because it really demonstrates that Ofsted have been doing this for decades. It's highly systemic, it's highly normalised, and it's indeed a kind of design feature of their work. More recently, I think this is a report from Mosside in Manchester, so one of the most economically deprived parts of the country, again serving largely Black Caribbean and Black African children. So talking about teachers, how they themselves have purported to display these kind of weak ideas and weak spoken standard English and grammar, and making too many errors, and indeed doubling down on the need that staff need to do more to correct pupils' poor language or indeed poor vocabulary. So positioning teachers as language police who kind of have this license to enact those ratiolinguistic ideologies and indeed inspect the word gap in what I would argue are really problematic ways. So Ofsted's training materials provide a really interesting insight into how those staff, how those inspectors are being actively trained to reproduce those ratiolinguistic ideologies in their own inspection work. So the revised inspection framework in 2019, again, I know there's people here from teacher education, so you'll be totally familiar with some of these new policy moves, very familiar with some of the language in those documents, and Ofsted's move to being a so-called research-driven institution, and again recycling this commitment to so-called social justice that Ofsted claim drives their work. And indeed, some of those recently leaked Ofsted training materials that were leaked online by a whistleblower, again, reproduce those word gap ideologies where inspectors are being actively trained to commend schools who have policies geared around the word gap. And indeed, we saw evidence from that in the inspection reports that I looked at on the previous slide. So at the bottom there's just a couple of slides that is taken from that Ofsted training materials. And again, you can see how they're citing Hart and Risley. You know, this is a study from 1995 that's received numerous critiques from educational linguists, from experts in applied linguists. Yet Ofsted are kind of recycling that as like the best available evidence when it comes to language in schools and vocabulary in schools. Yeah, and they name on that right hand slide, they name the 30 million word gap. Again, talking about language in terms of it being restricted, as limited, and that being the thing that limits schools. So just as we've seen, like, word gaps get really normalised in policy, in teacher textbooks, in education inspection frameworks, in Ofsted inspections, I'm just going to turn now a little bit to how those ideologies actually translate into schools, and how schools and teachers in some ways might be beginning to reproduce some of these things in their own practice. So I'm going to show a few pictures here of things that I took on a fieldwork visit to the same school that I talked about right at the beginning of this talk. So this is a school in southeast London, a school that was praised by Ofsted for its commitment to ambitious vocabulary. So here we have on one picture, so the so-called word graveyard, where words like happy, small, sad, cold, hot, etc. are being consigned to this graveyard. So children not allowed to use these words in class, in their written work, or in classroom discourse, and instead they have to use what is purportedly more ambitious vocabulary. So rather than saying hot, then students have to say boiling or scorching or blistering. And I saw this being like actively policed by teachers. So it's not just a display on a wall, but something that teachers are actually doing. Very similar, a word jail, so-called basic words being consigned to this word jail, so kind of literally criminalised in ways that I would argue are really, really problematic. And all of these things serve to do is just simply shut down very naturally occurring spoken language, where in naturally occurring classroom interaction, children are just drawing on their own natural language practices to trial out ideas, to imagine things, to try things out. but instead they risk having, they live in fear really of having their purportedly basic language policed. And the same idea about so-called tiered vocabulary, where so-called basic vocabulary is deemed to be not good enough, not ambitious enough, and therefore children need to modify and police their own language in order to be seen as legitimate. So what was interesting to me in this school talking to teachers was that, again, we saw that use and that justification of language like evidence-based, research-informed, social justice, etc. But actually all the consequences were that those children had their very natural ways of talking, and indeed their perfectly adequate ways of talking, policed, because they were deemed to violate these kind of hierarchically organised taxonomies of academic vocabulary or everyday vocabulary. And what happened was that teachers began to see home and academic as these two dichotomous categories, with only words that were deemed to be academic in nature granted legitimacy in the classroom. So moving towards the end then, and this touches on an article that I've got coming out in Race, Ethnicity and Education in the next couple of days. And in this work, I worked really closely with a brilliant teacher called Mawahib, again at a school in South London. And what Mawahib was trying to do was trying to really push back against some of those word gap policies and ideologies in her own school, because she believed, and quite rightly, she believed that those very same policies were actually causing harm to the very same students who she shared a community and shared a background with. So Mawahib was an expert teacher, right? She was an absolute expert in her subject. She had an MA in applied linguistics. She wanted to do a PhD. She came from the same community as the children she taught, those very same children that were having their natural ways of language being policed in schools. She actively read more critical, more contemporary research around the word gap. She was a real expert on it, and she did that in her role as literacy coordinator in the school, in an attempt to create new whole school language policies that she was beginning to frame as anti-racist policies in resisting and challenging some of those deficit discourses around the so-called word gap. When she presented her policy, however, management doubled down on those word gap interventions, reproducing and indeed doubling down on that language of evidence-informed practice and what works policy making as a reason, even though Mawahib's own evidence was expert, her own research was expert. So she had her own evidence and expertise called into question, and indeed her own language policed in favour of what is a linguistic solution posed as the answer to a structural problem. So moving really towards the end now. So what does it mean then to challenge the word gap? And indeed, I'm taking inspiration from like Mawahib's brilliant work in her school there. So first of all, it's really important to say that this is not about suggesting that for some reason teaching vocabulary is racist. Right? That's certainly not some of the challenges and some of the arguments that I'm putting forward. And indeed, this was the kind of line that the Daily Mail took when they picked up on some of my work and wrote an article about my work in the autumn, where they took the headline that in my work, what I was trying to do was brand school as racist for trying to improve pupils' vocabulary. Well, actually, I wasn't trying to do that at all, but that's the way that the right-wing press might take up work in anti-racism and respin it, of course, to suit their agenda. So challenging the word gap is not doing that, but it is about doing these things. It's about trying to really denaturalize and denormalize those highly durable and very, very normalized and embedded ratio-linguistic ideologies that have long circulated in schools. And again, shift attention away from the stigmatized speaker and shift attention towards the oppressive practices of what Rosa and Flores call the white listening subject. So it's about doing that, but it's also about pushing back against this really reductionist and really crude narrative and logic that we've seen so many times in Ofsted, in popular textbooks, in school policies, in state policy, for example, that really reductive narrative that, well, social justice can be achieved if marginalised children would just modify their language. For me, that isn't about social justice at all, because it's just replacing the burden and the pressure on the most marginalised members of society to adapt and assimilate their language towards idealised whiteness and idealised middle classness. So, very final slide then. So just to wrap it up. So conclusions that, again, taking that ratiolinguistic perspective, I think is really productive and really important, because it just begins to shift the analytical attention away from what speakers are doing and towards what hearers and perceivers are doing, because that's where the problem lies, right? The problem doesn't lie in the speaker, the problem lies in the listener. As I've shown then, those ideologies about the word gap feel like they're new, but actually, if we trace the history of them, they're deeply colonial, bolstered by academic knowledge production since the 1950s, and then kind of resurfaced in the last 30 years or so. And whilst those ideologies are absolutely rooted in those attitudes about linguistic deficit, actually they translate into huge and major economic profit. So they're a really effective way of turning those ideologies of linguistic deficit into economic profit. And indeed, there's now a whole kind of edu industry around the word gap, made up of things like teacher textbooks that we looked at, but also things like CPD programs and consultancy. So I hope I've kind of shown that I'm not saying at all that there's anything problematic with teaching vocabulary, but that certainly is problematic when that gets framed as that solution to curing broader social inequalities. And indeed, that very reductionist logic only continues to assign marginalised communities responsibility for addressing their own failures, whilst at the same time absolves and shifts responsibility away from the state, who have crafted and maintained those injustices in the first place. So thanks so much for listening. Oh, I also need to say thanks to BERA and the Spencer Foundation for funding this work. And yeah, if you're interested in reading more, then here's some things that I've written about the word gap and about Ofsted and raciolinguistic ideologies. But there's plenty of other critical work out there about the word gap. So I really hope that this work and other work in the UK is beginning to push back against some of those mainstream narratives. Thank you so much for inviting me and for listening.
Thank you, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating. I feel like I've learned so much tonight, and I'm sure that will be something echoed across the audience. There aren't any questions so far in the chat. So what I would say is, if you want to add any questions in there, feel free, and then I can read them out. But if you'd prefer just to raise your hand metaphorically through the little signalling, just we can go for that. And right on cue, Gillian straight away has done that, so that's great. Would you like to ask your question, Gillian? And you're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Thanks, Ian. That was fascinating. I would have found it really difficult to put my question in the chat because just so many things spring to mind. I don't want this to sound like I'm criticizing you or taking a critical view, and that I disagree with things that you were saying, but there were kind of things that went through my mind. You've just given a highly articulate, succinct presentation. Yeah. And okay, I suppose you could argue that to be an academic in the humanities, you need those skills. Or you need word richness, if dare I use that phrase, to be able to do that. And then I guess my thinking is that a lot of people who have certain jobs or have a lot of responsibility or are economically better off than others, also to do their jobs need to be articulate and succinct and need vocabulary. And a lot of the time, I think, you used the phrase cultural capital a little bit, not so much, but a lot of the time, sort of anecdotally, we know that young people who maybe don't move into those areas lack confidence because they say we don't speak like them. Yeah. Or they don't know, they sort of say, they might not say it, and again, you know, I might be, it sounds like I'm making generalizations, but can you talk the talk? And rather than coming in, I know it's potentially, again, a deficit position, but rather than coming in and saying, well, actually, the way you talk's absolutely fine, how does that position ourselves as educators if we can't, or if you like, what you're saying isn't about developing confidence to talk the talk and to be articulate and succinct?
Thanks, Gillian. There was a lot there, so I'll answer
I
it.
know, and I'm sorry I wasn't more articulate or succinct.
I think for me, like, we really need to very seriously question what we mean by words like articulate, because we run the risk of reproducing those very same ideologies that we're purporting and trying to be so critical of. So, like, take different categories in language, like articulate, correct grammar, academic language, whatever. Well, often those are framed as like these empirically definable things that are really observable and really that everyone agrees on. But often those things are rooted in the way that the most powerful have decided how those categories have come into being. And actually, talking to children in schools, like those boys that I was talking about in the presentation, they were perfectly articulate. They were perfectly able to produce so-called academic vocabulary. They were perfectly able to produce the type of language, as you say, talking the talk. It's just that school had made this decision that they weren't actually able to produce this kind of language. And school was a place where they weren't being given the opportunities to display and draw on their own natural linguistic creativity and dexterity and the whole range of linguistic repertoires and linguistic strengths that all children bring to school with them. So my critique really is of those ideologies around, well, who's getting to decide what counts as articulate and what counts as proper and what counts as academic, for example, but also how those structures might not just allow those very same children to display that linguistic creativity when they actually step into school. And the message that those type of children get is that the way that they use language at home is best left at the classroom door. It serves no place in school because it isn't legitimate in school. So they just reproduce that idea that they're bringing to school with them those very same deficits that they've come to internalize, I think.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks.
Thank you. My dog keeps barking in the background, so I had to turn myself on mute. Okay, thank you. Any other question? Are there any other questions for Ian about the presentation?
I had a few, but we've only got 4 minutes. So, but thanks a lot, though. Really good.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Peter.
I think one of the observations I have actually is how I was actually fairly surprised how much the Hart and Risley statistics were being used over and over again, even though they were out of context, but also out of date. You know, I just thought, well, that's they're just, you know, obviously you've shown here tonight that they're used quite regularly as if to prove something, when actually is that still the case anyway? And that
they're
was
also
something
made up. They're invented, those numbers. You know,
Yeah.
they're extrapolated from observations and then modelled.
Yeah.
So they're not even real.
Yeah, it just shows how things can become almost sort of urban myths in some respect, can't they? Because you know, you keep repeating them over and over again, and people do believe them. So yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Avril.
Now Sophie's typing, and I'm not sure whether she's going to type a question or.
She's been typing for about 20 minutes, so I think it'd be quite a question.
Yes, it might be one of those things where sometimes it looks like you're active, doesn't it? Okay. Yeah. Well, what I'll do is I'll stop filming or recording now.